Hey friends, Patrick here from the .NET Web Academy, and today you saw the title. We are going to have a look at CQRS, Command and Query Responsibility Segregation. Great term, right? Simply separating, updating and querying or creating an you get the idea in a minute. And also Mediator, the Mediator pattern, and we do all that in a .NET Web API and not in a clean architecture to keep things as simple as possible. So if you are interested in CQRS and Mediator, then keep watching. This is what we're going to do in this tutorial, and I would say without any fluff, let's start. All right, now before we start with implementing that, a tiny bit of theory first. Now what you see here is actually from the .NET Web Academy, where we go way deeper in there, of course, but here for now, this is the world without CQRS, without separating commands and queries. So the default way that you see quite often, I guess, on my channel as well, is when you have, for instance, a web API or a Blazor application, and that's what the UI component is here. And then you want to do something, any kind of CRUD operation, right? Then typically you have a service that is doing something. You inject the service in the UI component or in the controller, which is, well, it is part of a presentation layer when you have a look at the clean architecture, right? So maybe you could also say that this is still UI, a controller. And then this service maybe injects a repository, and the repository then is getting data from a database and then returning all that, right? So these things here, these arrows here, are in a case of a web API, the request, the HTTP request in essence. So we will implement a teeny tiny video game database where we can just request players, and then we get a player name, the ID, and the level of a player. And this would be the request then. Maybe you want to create a player, and in that request then you provide the name of the player and the current level of the player. And when you want to receive a certain player, then you provide the ID, right? And then it's always the same way: service, repository, database, and then back. Now with CQRS and Mediator, these are typically combined. It looks a tiny bit different. It's like that. So as you can see here now, you have still your UI components, of course, or your controller, but then in that controller or in the UI component, you inject something from the Mediator package in a .NET application, and this is also the Mediator pattern in that case. This means, well, maybe as the name already implies, the UI component or the controller has no idea about any services, repositories whatsoever. The only thing that the controller or the UI component knows is the mediator. This is the thing that we want to talk to, and the mediator gets certain requests, or to be more precise, either a command or a query, as you can see here. So these two things are the request. In the implementation, you will also see that we are actually using an iRequest interface, which we will then use as a command and a query. And now, why would you separate commands and queries? Again, these two are typically combined, but it's not necessary. You can still use the mediator here without commands and queries. But what you can do here with commands and queries is simply, a query is, well, receiving some data. So typically you just send an ID maybe with a query, or nothing at all actually with your query. You just want, for instance, get all the players, or in the blog you want to get all articles, all the data that you have in the database maybe. So this is just a query. It's an object, as you will see in a couple of minutes, that you provide or give the mediator, and the mediator then knows what to do. All right, so the mediator really knows, okay, this is this kind of query, say no more, I will give you all the data you want. Now with a command, this is different. A command is something that also changes data in the database. So either you create something, you update something, or you even delete something, and all these are then commands. So typically you separate these because commands can, in essence, destroy something, right? But the query doesn't. The query is only reading something, and this is the separation then. And now the mediator knows what to do. So the mediator then uses command handlers and query handlers, and these things then, the handlers in the end, use a service, and then the repository, and so on, right? So the thing that we saw before, actually, with the services, then the repository, and so on, these come actually after the command handlers. But the great thing then is that the UI doesn't have to know anything about that. So we only focus on the mediator together with the command and the queries. All right, so far the theory. I hope you're not too confused yet. Now let's have a look at the code. So what do I have here so far? We have a really simple web API with .NET 8, meaning regarding the models, I have a player model, ID, name, level. ID is also an integer similar to the level, so no GUID here. Of course, you can also use a GUID, doesn't really matter in the end. We have an in-memory database, really simple, using Entity Framework, as you can see here in the program CS. This is everything I did so far. So add DB context, and to make this work, we have to add the in-memory package with NuGet, and then I have a player controller. So this is the other world, right? A typical controller. I know, I'm already seeing the mean comments here. I injected the context in the controller really, really bad. We have a fat controller here, so all the logic. Of course, this is not how you would do it in a professional environment, right? I know that, I think, but for this example, this is what we have so far. And now we want to turn that around into using CQRS and MediatR. But let's run this real quick. We restart the application, and then hopefully here's Swagger UI, and this is everything we got, right? So we have a post request, and let's just say this is player 1, for instance, with the level 1. ID doesn't really matter here, so typically we would also use a data transfer object because we don't want to provide an ID. ID is done by Entity Framework in this case, and you see what's returned, it's just the ID, right? So we can copy the ID now, and then here we try this out, paste the ID, hit execute, and we get the player. Great, right? So this is how this works. Awesome application so far. But as you can see, we injected the context. And if you want to use a service in between or a repository in between, then this stuff would be injected in the controller here. If you change something about that, about the service, about the repository, whatever it is, then you also have to change that inside your controller. Now this is different with MediatR because still you have only one command that's still the same, and if anything changes then regarding services, controllers, database even, you do that in your backend, right? Really, you do that in the command handler. There's no struggle actually in your, well, let's say front end here on the controller side. But let's do that now simply. So first, let's add MediatR, the MediatR package. So manage NuGet packages. We browse, see in memory. Here's the last thing that I was looking for. And now we've got MediatR, simple, unambitious MediatR implementation in .NET. Great thing, 203 million downloads. Great stuff, Jimmy Bogart, really. So let's install that, and then in our program CS, we do the following. We write, maybe here, builder services, add MediatR, but this thing needs a configuration. So configuration it is. And then here we add configuration, register services from assembly, and here we say type of, and then program, because we have our program CS class here, and then assembly. But there's one parenthesis, too many. Well, just remove it. Now, what is this thing doing? Registers various handlers from assembly, all right? And here we as you can see, registers handlers and mediator types from the specified assembly. So our assembly is just our program in this case, our complete application in that case. If you are using clean architecture and maybe add MediatR in your application layer, then in this case, typically you have another file and then function where you add all your services or register all your services and also MediatR. And then in that case, you would use this assembly then. But here in our small example, we can of course use whatever we have here. It's just one project, so let's do that. Let's use that, and with that, MediatR is registered in our application. So now we can use MediatR to use commands and queries and talk to our database in the end with that. So now the next step really is to create commands and queries. For that, typically it's debatable how you want to structure that in your application. Again, this is not a clean architecture. What we have here, we have just one project, but still makes sense to use some folders. And maybe you want to use feature folders. And now what I want to use is player features actually. So again, under features, we use players. And now inside this players folder, you have so many options really. Again, there's so much stuff that's up to you and that's debatable. What you can do now here is either you directly create folders for your single commands and queries, meaning what we could do is just create a new folder now and say create player. This is one feature, right? And then also another feature and query would be get player by ID, for instance, right? And in there, then here we create our command and the command handler, the corresponding handler, and same thing here, we create a query and the corresponding query handler. Other options would be to create a commands folder or a queries folder and then put your stuff in there. Again, so many options, right? So I would say we do it like that. We have our create player folder, we have our get player by ID folder, and in here now we create a new item. So let's focus on the create player command first. And this is then our create player command, all right? And then you always have this pair. So new item, create player command handler, all right? And this is your request object. So similar to a DTO in the end, a data transfer object, right? But it implements now the I request. See, this comes from MediatR, and it says marker interface to represent a request with a void response. But actually I want to return something, and that would be the ID. So the ID is actually just an integer. And in that case now with a response, T-response is an integer, all right? But still we need something, right? In that request, again, very similar to a DTO, you can now say, okay, what is it that I want to provide? What is it that I want to give my mediator here or my server here, you name it, so it is able to create the player? Well, it's in this case the name of the player and the level of the player. So you can either use stuff like that, right? Typically your class with properties, so you would have your string, and then how did I call this? The name, of course, the name, not my property name, it's just name. And by default, let's say this is just an empty string. And then we also have the level like that. Or you just use a record, right? This would also work. So now instead of a class, we just use public record. And here now we have string name, int level, and like that. And we're done. Okay, so this is our create player command. Now comes the handler. Now this thing implements the I request handler, also part of MediatR. And as you can see now, already suggests here that, well, that's not really correct, but what we want here is our request type. And in that particular case, this is our create player command. And then we also want the response type, and again, this is an integer. Now Visual Studio is not happy here because we have to implement something with control and period IC, implement this interface, and as you can see now, we got a handle method here. And in that handle method now, we implement the logic that we actually implemented in our controller before. So what we need now is actually our database context. So here we have the video game app in DB context. We generate a constructor, and again, when we have a look at our controller here, what we can do is almost the same. We say context players add, but now we don't have the player, right? So what can we do here is really simple. We just create a new player. So a new player where we set the name now to the request name, and the level is our request level, like that. Now we add the player. we of course have an async method here. So now we can save the changes, and then we return without OK just the new player ID. All right, so this is now our handler. So you see the logic is moved to the command handler now, and in the controller we are going to use this thing, the mediator, with the new command to create the player. So here we inject something else. And of course, when we also change the query, we can remove the context here. But this now is the private read-only I sender. Let's call this sender here as well. And it's already in the using directive is already added here. And let's now add the parameter first, because we still have both worlds here, right? And now here, instead of the player and the player, in the create player method, we do the following. We have our create player command, call this command as well. And then we just say our player ID. So the result is already await sender send, and then just the command. Okay, so we can remove this, and then return the player ID. And that's it. Okay, so of course it's a bit more, kinda, because we first have our commands, but you see the separation. Do you feel the difference here, right? It in my opinion, it feels great because it's really reduced the whole logic here in the controller, and we still have the context here. So you will see in a couple of minutes how it looks then with getting a player. But let's try that already with creating, or with the command to create a player. All right, so hopefully there it is. Yep, there we are. So now let's try this out. You see already now we only have the name and the level, similar to DTO. Again, I know I'm repeating myself, but hopefully you learn it that way. And now regarding the name, let's call this Spider-Man. I know. And Spider-Man has the level 100, of course. We hit execute and we get the ID. So this worked really. And of course, still we have a strange combination of using mediator and not using mediator, but we get Spider-Man with level 100. Okay, so this is already the command. And now let's create our query. So here now we add a new item, call this get player by ID query. And also here add new item, get player by ID query handler. All right. Now this is still pretty similar. We can just use a record here and say, in this case, we just want the ID, and this thing inherits from I request and returns then the complete player in this case. So video game models, and here mediator. And this thing then again is used in the query handler. So here now, again, I request handler, we are using the query and we are returning the player. And now again we implement the interface, and similar to the command handler, we use this stuff here, and there it is. Paste this here. Of course, this is a different handler now. So as you can see, we inject the context again, and in the handle method now we can have again a look here at the controller. Copy that, paste this here, async, and simply return the player. Here we have to change the actual request, of course. Now the player could be null here, as you can see in the warning, so maybe we can change something actually. Here we just return a nullable player and do the same here as well. And when we now go to the query, we can change that also. So now this should actually work. And now in the controller, that was again, we just say we want to use the sender with a query now. So we can also just create the query here. So new get player by ID query, for instance, with the provided ID. And this is of course the player, not the player ID. But if the player is null, then we return not found, nor found, not found. That's what I wanted. And otherwise, we return OK player like that. Now let's test that again. Saved everything. There's Swagger. And again, we create a player first. This time it's Batman, level 99. And now we have the ID 1. Okay, let's create another one. Iron Man 98. Execute level 2. ID is 2 now, as you can see there. And now the get method. Try this out. 1, and we get Batman, and 2, we get Iron Man. And what about 3? Execute 404, not found. Great. And now, as you of course know, we can remove our context here actually, because we don't need it anymore. We only have our sender. Can restart the application, and this then still works just fine. And this is how you implement CQRS and MediatR, or with MediatR, in a .NET Web API in a hopefully short enough tutorial so you get up to speed here with this technique, let's say, or this pattern. You name it. I hope you liked it and you learned something. If so, please, as always, guys, hit the subscribe button and maybe also the like button. And maybe you want to check out the .NET Web Academy. Link, as always, in the video description. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope I see you next time. Take care.